Sometimes the very thing that makes you different is exactly what someone else has been praying for. Sometimes being rejected by the wrong person leads you straight to the right one. In the fjord-village of Skarlund, Solveig stepped off a longboat as a mail-order bride, only to be turned away for standing too tall. Her intended groom called her cursed and walked away, leaving her stranded and humiliated before the entire village. But Brandr the Tall had been watching from the shadows. This legendary warrior knew what it felt like to be alone because of his size. While others mocked Solveig, he saw strength. While they saw a problem, he saw his perfect match. That night, he approached her with a simple carved wooden rose and changed both their lives forever. What happens when two outcasts discover they were meant to find each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like a shroud, curling around the wooden docks where longboats bobbed against their moorings. Skarlund had awakened to another grey dawn, the kind that painted everything in shades of resignation. Here, where the mountains met the sea in jagged embrace, life moved to rhythms older than memory, rhythms of survival, tradition, and the unforgiving seasons that shaped both land and... Character Solveig Eriksdottir pulled her mother's worn woolen cloak tighter against the salt-tinged wind as she gazed across the village that was supposed to become her home. 3 days had passed since her arrival. 3 days since the rejection that had left her rootless as driftwood. The crumpled parchment, her marriage contract, lay hidden in her traveling sack. A document that had once promised security, but now served only as reminder of how thoroughly plans could crumble. The village of Skarlund sprawled along the water's edge like weathered bones, its long houses built from timber dark with age and salt spray. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy spirals, carrying the scents of cooking fish and burning peat. Women moved between buildings with purposeful steps, their heads covered against the morning chill, while men tended nets or hammered at boat repairs. Everything here spoke of permanence, of roots sunk deep into rocky soil. Everything except Solveig herself. She stood a full head taller than most women in the village, her frame built for strength rather than the delicate compliance that seemed prized here. Back home in her father's house, her height had been seen as useful, better for reaching high shelves, for carrying heavy loads, for the endless work that kept a household running. But here, among strangers who measured worth by different scales, her stature marked her as wrong somehow, as if the gods had made an error in her crafting. The marriage broker who had arranged her passage had said nothing about height requirements. He had spoken only of Gunnar Helgason, a widower in need of a wife to tend his home and bear his children. A practical arrangement, he had assured her father. A good match for a woman whose dowry consisted more of willing hands than silver. But Gunnar had taken one look at her towering frame and declared the contract void, his voice carrying across the village square like a pronouncement of doom. "Too tall for my hearth," he had said, his words sharp with finality. "Too tall for proper submission. The gods marked this one for different purposes, and I'll not have her shadow cast over my house." Now, Solveig found herself adrift in a place that viewed her with suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. The village elder, a weathered man named Thorvald, had grudgingly allowed her temporary shelter in the weaving house, but his charity came with pointed reminders that hospitality had limits. She would need to find her place here quickly, or find passage elsewhere, though with what coin? She could not say. The weaving house sat at the village's heart, its windows facing the square where daily life unfolded like an intricate tapestry. From her small, sleeping alcove, Solveig could observe the rhythms of Skarlund society. She watched wives greet their husbands with measured affection. Children play games passed down through generations, and unmarried women move with the careful steps of those whose futures hung on others' approval. She had learned the village hierarchy quickly enough. Thorvald the elder held final word on disputes and marriages, his authority stemming from both age and wisdom hard-won through decades of leadership. The wealthy landowners, Men like Gunnar, who owned more than just their family plots, formed the next tier, their voices carrying weight in village councils. Below them came the skilled craftsmen, the fishermen, the laborers whose strong backs built and maintained the community. And then there were the women, whose status flowed from their men's positions and their own ability to fulfill expected roles. The most respected were mothers of many children, wives who managed households with quiet efficiency, daughters whose marriages strengthened clan alliances. Those who fell outside these categories, the childless, the widowed without family, the unmarried past their prime, existed on society's margins, tolerated but never quite belonging. Solveig understood she occupied a category all her own, the rejected bride, neither maiden nor wife, neither fully welcomed nor completely cast out. The village women spoke to her with careful politeness, their conversations polite but distant. The men avoided her gaze entirely, perhaps fearing what association with a cursed woman might bring to their own standing. But there was one man who did not look away, Brandr Eriksson, no relation, despite the shared name, stood apart from Skarlund's social fabric in ways that had nothing to do with rejection and everything to do with fearsome reputation. Where others clustered in groups sharing news and gossip, Brandr moved alone. Where others gathered by the fire for evening stories, he remained in the shadows. Where others sought approval and belonging, he seemed to have long ago accepted that his path ran solitary. The villagers called him Brandr the Tall, though the name carried more weight than simple description. His height matched Solveig's own unusual stature, but on his frame it seemed natural, even necessary. Broad shoulders and powerful arms spoke of strength that went beyond the physical. This was a man who had faced death and emerged victorious so many times that mortality itself seemed to bend around him. His war axe, ancient and battle-scarred, hung at his side like a permanent shadow. The weapon had tasted blood in conflicts stretching back decades, its blade nicked and stained from encounters that had become legend. Children whispered stories of Brandr's exploits, how he had single-handedly held a mountain pass against 20 raiders, how his war cry could freeze enemy hearts, how he had once carried a wounded chieftain 30 miles through winter storms to safety. Yet for all his fearsome reputation, Brandr lived quietly in a cottage at the village's edge, tending a small plot of land and keeping largely to himself. He attended village gatherings when duty required it, contributed his share to common defenses, and offered his counsel when asked, but always from the periphery, always with the invisible barrier that surrounded those who had seen too much of war's cruelty. Solveig had noticed him immediately, not just for his height, but for the way he watched the world with eyes that missed nothing while committing to little. During her humiliating rejection ceremony, while others had gaped and whispered, Brandr had observed in silence from beside the great oak that marked the village center. His expression had revealed nothing, but something in his stillness had felt different from the crowd's casual cruelty. She had caught glimpses of him since then, working his small garden in the early morning, walking the village perimeter at dusk, standing guard during the night watches that protected Skarlund from raiders and wild beasts. He moved with the fluid grace of a man comfortable with violence, but she had also noticed smaller details, the way he avoided stepping on the flowers that grew wild near his cottage, how he left scraps for the village dogs, the careful precision with which he mended his own clothes. There were stories about Brandr's past, whispered fragments that painted a picture of tragedy and transformation. He had been married once, long ago, to a woman named Astrid, who had died in the plague that swept through the northern settlements 15 winters past. Some said he had loved her with the same fierce intensity he brought to battle. Others claimed her death had broken something in him that could never be repaired. What no one disputed was that Brandr had thrown himself into warfare after Astrid's passing, seeking death in every conflict he could find. But death seemed to avoid him with the same consistency that life had abandoned him. He emerged from battles that claimed dozens of other warriors, bore scars that should have been mortal wounds, and earned a reputation that made enemies flee rather than face his wrath. Eventually, the wars had ended or moved to distant lands, leaving Brandr stranded in peace like a ship run aground. He had returned to Skarlund, not as the young man who had left to marry his beloved, but as a walking legend whose presence reminded everyone of mortality's fragility. The village respected him, feared him, and kept its distance, grateful for his protection, but uncertain how to integrate such raw, untamed grief into their carefully ordered lives. Now, as Solveig worked at the great loom in the weaving house, she found herself thinking often of the solitary warrior. There was something in his isolation that echoed her own displacement, something in his careful distance that spoke to the walls she had learned to build around her own heart. They were both outsiders here. She realized, she by circumstance, he by choice, but outsiders nonetheless. The loom beneath her hands was old but well maintained, its wooden frame worn smooth by generations of weavers. Working it required strength and coordination, qualities that her unusual height actually aided rather than hindered. The village women had been surprised by her skill, perhaps expecting that her physical differences would extend to incompetence in traditional crafts. But Solveig had learned weaving at her mother's side, spending countless winter evenings creating the textiles that clothed her family and provided modest income through trade. Her long arms could manage the wide looms that produced the heavy woolens needed for northern winters, and her steady hands could create patterns that pleased even critical eyes. As she worked, Solveig allowed her mind to wander through the paths that had led her to this strange place. Her father's farm had suffered through 3 poor harvests, leaving the family with debts that threatened everything they had built. Marriage to a prosperous widower had seemed like salvation, not just for her, but for her younger siblings who needed dowries of their own. The marriage broker had painted pictures of comfortable domesticity, of a husband grateful for a willing wife, and a household that would value her contributions. None of those promises had mentioned the importance of proper height or appropriate humility. None had warned that arriving as agreed upon might still result in rejection and exile. The crumpled parchment in her sack represented more than a broken contract. It was the symbol of how completely she had misunderstood her place in the world. The afternoon light slanted through the weaving house windows, casting long shadows across her work. Soon the village would settle into evening routines, families gathering for supper while she remained alone with her thoughts and her growing uncertainty about the future. Tomorrow would bring new questions about her status here, new pressures to find a permanent solution to the problem of her presence. But tonight, as the familiar rhythm of the loom soothed her troubled mind, Solveig allowed herself to hope that somewhere in this harsh but beautiful place, there might yet be room for someone like her, someone too tall for convention, but perhaps not too tall for love. The village square buzzed with an energy that made Solveig's stomach clench. 3 days of whispered conversations and sidelong glances had culminated in this moment, a formal gathering called by Elder Thorvald to address what the villagers had begun calling the situation. Solveig stood at the edge of the crowd, her height making it impossible to disappear despite her desperate wish to become invisible. Gunnar Helgason occupied the center of attention like a man born to it. His chest puffed with righteous indignation as he addressed the assembled villagers. His voice carried the practiced authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I've been patient," Gunnar declared, his words cutting through the evening air. "More patient than custom demands. But this cannot continue. The woman was sent here under false pretenses. She does not match what was promised, and I will not be bound by a contract built on deception." Solveig felt heat rise in her cheeks as dozens of eyes turned toward her. The marriage contract, that crumpled parchment that had once represented hope, had become the subject of public debate. Every detail of her perceived inadequacies was being dissected before people who would judge her worth based on another man's rejection. "She stands too tall," Gunnar continued, warming to his theme. "Too proud. A wife should fit properly beneath her husband's arm, should look up to him with proper deference. This one would tower over me in our own house, and what manner of children would come from such unnatural proportions? The gods themselves have marked her as unsuitable for marriage." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, others frowned with uncertainty. Traditional marriages were serious business in Skarlund, involving not just two individuals, but entire families and their standing in the community. A rejected bride created problems that extended far beyond personal preference. Elder Thorvald raised his weathered hand for silence. His grey beard caught the last light of evening as he considered the situation with the gravity it seemed to demand. "The contract was negotiated in good faith," he said slowly. "But marriage cannot be forced upon an unwilling groom. The question becomes what obligation the village has to one who arrived here under such circumstances." "None," said Gunnar's sister Ingrid, her voice sharp with authority. She was a woman who had married well and never let others forget it. She came here as a bride, not as a villager seeking settlement. If she cannot fulfill that purpose, she should return to wherever she came from. And how would you suggest she manage that? The voice came from an unexpected quarter. Astrid the baker, an older woman whose husband had died 2 seasons past. "The journey here cost her last silver. Would you have us cast her into the wilderness with empty hands?" "That is not our concern," Ingrid replied coldly. "We did not create this problem." Solveig's hands trembled as the debate continued around her, as if she were some broken tool whose disposal required careful consideration. Each word felt like a stone thrown at her dignity. Each suggestion another reminder of how completely she had misjudged her situation. She had come here hoping to build a life, only to discover that her very existence posed a problem requiring solution. "Perhaps," suggested Magnus the blacksmith, his voice rumbling like distant thunder, "we could find her other work. The harvest season approaches, and strong hands are always useful." "Strong hands, yes," said Gunnar with a laugh that held no warmth. "But what man would take such a wife after seeing her rejected by another? She carries the mark of refusal now. Who would risk the gossip, the questions about what hidden flaws drove a willing groom away?" The crowd's attention shifted back to Solveig, and she felt the weight of their collective judgment. In their eyes, she read pity, curiosity, distaste, and calculation. Some looked at her as they might a wounded animal, with compassion but no real desire to take responsibility. Others saw only the inconvenience she represented to their ordered lives. "I can work," Solveig said suddenly, her voice carrying farther than she had intended. The square fell silent as she stepped forward, drawing on reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. "I can weave, I can tend animals, I can manage a household. I ask for no charity, only the chance to earn my place here." "Earn your place?" Gunnar's laugh was harsh. "You were brought here for one purpose, and that purpose cannot be fulfilled. What place could there be for a woman who serves no man, who fits no proper role?" The cruelty in his words hit Solveig like a physical blow. She had known rejection before, quiet disappointments and private wounds, but never had her worth been debated so publicly. Never had her very existence been treated as a burden, requiring disposal. In the growing dusk, shadows lengthened across the square. Torches flickered to life near the elder's platform, casting dancing light across faces that seemed to blur together in a sea of judgment. Solveig felt herself becoming smaller despite her height, shrinking under the weight of communal disapproval, and then she saw him. Brandr the Tall stood apart from the crowd, half hidden by the massive oak tree that marked the village center. His face remained in shadow, but something in his stillness drew her attention like a beacon in a storm. While others gestured and argued and debated her fate, he simply watched, not with the hungry curiosity of those seeking entertainment, but with something deeper and more difficult to name. Their eyes met across the square, and for a moment the noise of the crowd faded to a distant hum. In Brandr's gaze, Solveig saw recognition of a kind she had never experienced. Not the recognition of familiarity, but of shared understanding. He knew what it felt like to stand apart, to be judged by standards that seemed designed to find fault. Elder Thorvald was speaking again, his words carrying the weight of decision. "The village will provide shelter for 7 more days," he announced. "In that time, if no suitable arrangement can be made, passage will be sought to return the woman to her family. 7 days. Solveig felt the number settle over her like a countdown to execution. 7 days to find a place in a community that had already decided she did not belong. 7 days to transform herself into something acceptable to people who viewed her as fundamentally flawed. The crowd began to disperse, conversations continuing in smaller groups as people drifted toward their homes and evening meals. Solveig remained standing in the square as the world moved around her, feeling more alone than she had ever felt in her life. But Brandr had not moved from his position by the oak tree. As the last of the villagers disappeared into their homes, he stepped forward into the torchlight. His approach was unhurried but purposeful, each step deliberate as he crossed the empty square. Up close, his size was even more impressive. Not just tall, but built with the kind of strength that came from years of wielding heavy weapons and facing mortal danger. Yet when he stopped before her, something in his manner gentled. From somewhere within his worn leather jerkin, he withdrew a small object and extended it toward her without speaking. In the flickering torchlight, Solveig could see it was a wooden rose, roughly carved but unmistakably crafted with care. The petals were imperfect, the stem uneven, but the hours spent creating it showed in every carefully shaped curve. This was not the work of a moment, but of long evenings by firelight, of patient attention to detail, of someone who understood that beauty could emerge from unlikely materials. Solveig stared at the offered gift, her heart hammering against her ribs. No one had ever given her flowers, not real ones, and certainly not something carved with such deliberate intention. The wooden rose represented something she had never dared hope for. Someone who saw her not as a problem to be solved, but as a person worthy of thoughtful attention. "For you," Brandr said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, but carrying unmistakable sincerity. Their fingers brushed as she accepted the rose, and Solveig felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of despair that had formed during the evening's humiliation. Here was kindness without calculation, attention without agenda, acceptance without condition. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the evening wind. Brandr nodded once, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows beyond the torchlight. But the wooden rose remained warm in Solveig's hands, its rough edges somehow perfect, its simple beauty a promise that not all the world would judge her and find her wanting. For the first time since arriving in Skarlund, Solveig smiled. Dawn broke grey and cold over Skarlund, painting the fjord in shades of pewter and mist. Solveig woke, clutching the wooden rose to her chest, its rough edges having left small impressions on her palm through the night. The carved gift had become her anchor in a sea of uncertainty, proof that kindness could exist even in places where she felt most unwelcome. Her small, sleeping alcove in the weaving house offered little privacy, but it provided shelter and a purpose, 2 things that had become precious commodities since her rejection. The other women who worked here had been polite but distant, treating her like a temporary inconvenience rather than a potential friend. Still, she was grateful for Elder Thorvald's grudging charity, even as she understood its limits. 6 days remained of her allotted time. Solveig wrapped her mother's woolen cloak around her shoulders, the familiar weight offering comfort that went beyond mere warmth. The cloak had been her mother's most prized possession, woven from wool, traded at great expense, and dyed with berries gathered from distant hillsides. Its deep blue color had faded over the years, but the craftsmanship remained evident in every thread. Her mother had pressed the cloak into her hands before her departure, tears streaming down weathered cheeks. "You carry our hopes with you," she had whispered. "But more than that, you carry our love. Remember that you are worthy of happiness, my daughter, no matter what challenges you may face." Those words echoed in Solveig's mind as she made her way to the great loom that had become her temporary workplace. The village was stirring to life around her, smoke rising from cooking fires, children's voices calling across courtyards, the steady rhythm of daily labor beginning anew. It was a comforting sound, this evidence of life continuing despite personal upheavals. The loom stood empty and waiting, its wooden frame solid and reassuring beneath her hands. Weaving had always calmed her mind, the repetitive motions allowing her thoughts to flow as smoothly as thread through the warp. Today, she was working on a length of heavy wool that would become winter cloaks for the village's children, practical work that served a clear need. As she settled into the familiar rhythm, Solveig became aware of movement outside the weaving house windows. Brandr was passing by on his morning rounds, his tall frame moving with the fluid grace she had begun to recognize. He paused when he saw her at the loom, offering a slight nod that might have been greeting or simply acknowledgement. The gesture sent warmth spreading through her chest. After the wooden rows, she had wondered if their moment in the square had been an aberration, a single act of kindness that would not be repeated. But this small recognition suggested otherwise. Perhaps there was more to explore in whatever connection had sparked between them. Astrid the baker entered the weaving house carrying a wooden bowl that steamed in the morning air. The older woman had shown Solveig more kindness than most, perhaps understanding the particular vulnerability that came with widowhood and social displacement. "I brought you some porridge," Astrid said, setting the bowl on the small table beside the loom. "You need to keep your strength up, especially if you're to finish that cloth before winter sets in properly." "Thank you," Solveig replied, touched by the simple generosity. "You've been very kind to me," Astrid waved dismissively, but her eyes held genuine warmth. "We women must look after each other when we can. The world is hard enough without adding unnecessary cruelties." She paused, glancing around to ensure they were alone. "I saw Brandr speak with you last evening." The comment hung in the air like a question waiting to be answered. Solveig felt heat rise in her cheeks, unsure how to explain the wooden rows or the strange sense of recognition she had felt in the warrior's presence. "He gave me a gift," she said carefully. "A carved flower. I don't know why, don't you?" Astrid's smile held depths of understanding that spoke to decades of observing human nature. "Brandr is not a man given to idle gestures. If he offered you something, he had his reasons. I know little about him beyond the stories others tell." "Stories have a way of growing in the telling," Astrid said thoughtfully. "The truth is often simpler and more complex than legend suggests. Brandr is a good man who has carried more grief than most could bear. Perhaps he sees in you something that resonates with his own experience." The idea that her troubles might somehow connect with those of the legendary warrior seemed almost too much to hope for. "What do you mean?" Astrid settled herself on a nearby stool, her expression growing serious. "Brandr knows what it feels like to be set apart, to have his very presence remind others of things they would rather forget. The village respects him, but keeps its distance, grateful for his protection, but uncomfortable with the pain he carries." Solveig's hands stilled on the loom as she absorbed this insight. "He's been alone all these years?" "By choice, mostly. There have been women who would welcome his attention, widows seeking security, maidens drawn to his reputation, but he has shown interest in none of them. Until now, perhaps. The suggestion that Brandr might be interested in her seemed almost impossible to believe. Men had never paid her much attention, put off by her unusual height and the practical nature of her upbringing. The idea that someone might see those differences as assets rather than flaws challenged everything she had learned to expect from the world. "I don't understand why he would notice me," Solveig admitted. "Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind cannot explain," Astrid said gently. "Perhaps you remind him that he is not the only one who feels displaced in a world that seems designed for others." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ingrid, Gunnar's sister, who swept into the weaving house with the authority of someone accustomed to having her presence acknowledged. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the shared breakfast, the intimate conversation, the obvious warmth between the two women. "Astrid," Ingrid said coolly, "I hope you are not encouraging unrealistic expectations in our temporary guest. The words carried subtle but unmistakable threat. Ingrid held significant influence in the village, and her disapproval could make life difficult for anyone who crossed her. Astrid's kindness to Solveig was clearly being noted and judged. "I'm sharing a meal with someone who works hard and asks for little," Astrid replied with quiet dignity. "Surely there is no harm in basic Christian charity." "Charity has its place," Ingrid agreed, "but so does practical wisdom. The woman's situation remains unchanged." "7 days," the elder said. "It would be cruel to offer false hope." Solveig felt her cheeks burn with renewed shame. Even moments of simple human connection were being scrutinized for appropriateness, measured against the countdown that marked her remaining time in Skarlund. "I expect no false hope," Solveig said quietly. "Only the chance to work honestly for what shelter I receive." Ingrid's gaze lingered on her with calculating coldness. "Work is well and good, but it does not solve the fundamental problem of your status here. A woman without family, without husband, without established place. Such situations require careful management." The threat was clear. Solveig's presence was being tolerated, not accepted, and that tolerance had strict limits. Any suggestion that she might be forming connections or finding permanent footing would be met with swift correction. After Ingrid departed, the weaving house felt smaller and more oppressive. Astrid gathered her bowl and prepared to leave, but she paused to squeeze Solveig's shoulder with gentle firmness. "Do not let her words steal your hope," the older woman whispered. "There are more ways to find belonging than the ones she would approve of." Alone again with her loom, Solveig tried to focus on the familiar rhythm of her work. But her thoughts kept drifting to the wooden rose hidden in her belongings, to Brandr's unexpected kindness, and to the growing sense that perhaps her story in Skarlund was not yet finished. The old loom sang beneath Solveig's hands as she worked the heavy wool into patterns that would serve the village's children through the coming winter. 3 days had passed since her conversation with Astrid, and the rhythm of daily labor had begun to feel less foreign, more like something approaching belonging. The other women no longer watched her with quite the same suspicion, though their acceptance remained tentative, conditional on her continued temporary status. 5 days remained. The artifact that dominated her world now was this ancient loom, its wooden frame worn smooth by generations of hands that had created the textiles essential for survival in this harsh climate. Working it required not just skill, but strength, the kind of physical power that her unusual height provided in abundance. Where other women might struggle with the wide warps needed for heavy cloaks, Solveig could manage them with relative ease. Word of her weaving skill had begun to spread through the village, carried by the practical approval of women who recognized quality work when they saw it. The cloth she produced was tight and even, the patterns clear and well executed. More importantly, she worked quickly without sacrificing craftsmanship, a combination that held real value in a community always racing against winter's approach. Elder Thorvald had visited the weaving house the previous afternoon, examining her work with the careful eye of someone who understood the economics of textile production. He had said little, but his nod of approval carried weight that extended beyond mere politeness. "Good work," he had admitted grudgingly. "Better than I expected." The faint praise had warmed Solveig more than she cared to admit. After days of feeling like an unwelcome burden, any acknowledgement of her contributions felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Now, as morning light slanted through the weaving house windows, she found herself hoping that perhaps skill and diligence might open doors that beauty and conventional proportions had left firmly closed. If she could make herself valuable enough, perhaps the village might find reasons to overlook her other failings. The sound of heavy footsteps outside drew her attention. Through the window she could see Brandr approaching with his characteristic measured gait, but today he carried something, a wooden bucket that seemed to require careful handling. As he drew closer, she could see steam rising from whatever it contained. He paused at the weaving house door, seeming to gather himself before entering. When he stepped inside, His presence immediately filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. There was something about him that commanded attention without demanding it, a quality of contained strength that made the air itself feel different. "I brought you something," he said simply, setting the bucket on the floor beside her loom. The rich aroma of dye rose from the steaming liquid, a deep red that spoke of careful preparation and considerable expense. Solveig stared at the gift, overwhelmed by its implications. Dye of this quality was precious, requiring materials that cost more than most families could afford. The madder root and other ingredients necessary to achieve such a vibrant red had to be traded from distant lands, making this bucket worth more than many villagers earned in a season. "I cannot accept this," she said softly, though her heart ached at the necessity of refusal. "It's too valuable to—" "You can use it," Brandr interrupted gently. "Your work deserves proper materials." The simple statement carried depths of meaning that made Solveig's throat tight with emotion. No one had ever suggested that her work deserved the finest materials, that her skill warranted investment rather than mere tolerance. The implied respect in his gesture touched something deep within her that had been wounded by years of practical dismissal. "Why?" she asked, the question emerging before she could stop it. Brandr was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he studied the loom and the cloth taking shape beneath her fingers. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone choosing words with unusual care. "Because you work with honor," he said finally. "Because you create beauty from simple materials. Because you deserve to have your efforts recognized." The honesty in his answer made Solveig's eyes burn with unshed tears. She had spent so many years accepting that her contributions were merely practical, useful, but not valued. That this acknowledgement of beauty in her work felt revolutionary. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Brandr nodded once, then seemed to hesitate as if weighing whether to say more. "I have watched you work," he admitted. "You have skill that should not be wasted on rough materials." The admission that he had been observing her sent warmth spreading through Solveig's chest. The idea that someone as legendary as Brandr the Tall would take time to notice her daily labors seemed almost impossible to believe. "I learned from my mother," she said, finding her voice again. "She taught me that honest work deserves to be done well, regardless of who might notice. She taught you wisdom." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the bucket of precious dye steaming between them like a bridge across the careful distance they had both maintained. Solveig found herself studying Brandr's face, noting details she had not noticed before, the careful way he held himself, as if always prepared for danger, the surprising gentleness in his dark eyes, the small scar that marked his left temple. "The village speaks of extending your time here," Brandr said suddenly, his words careful and measured. "Your work has impressed Elder Thorvald." Hope flared in Solveig's chest like flame, catching tinder. "Truly? There is talk of offering you permanent place in the weaving house. Not as temporary guest, but as contributing member of the community." The possibility seemed too wonderful to trust, yet Brandr's serious manner suggested he would not offer false comfort. If the village was indeed considering her for permanent settlement, it would solve the immediate crisis of her displacement while offering something she had never dared hope for, a place where her skills were valued rather than merely tolerated. "What would that mean?" she asked. "It would mean you belong here," Brandr said simply. "It would mean you have earned your place through your own efforts, not through marriage or family connection." The idea of belonging through merit rather than circumstance felt like salvation. But even as hope bloomed within her, Solveig found herself thinking of the man who had made this conversation possible. Whatever opportunity might be opening for her, it was Brandr's recognition and encouragement that had helped her see her own worth clearly. "Would you—" she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice the question forming in her mind. "Would I what? Would you be pleased if I stayed?" Brandr's expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face. For a moment, the legendary warrior disappeared, replaced by a man whose loneliness was as deep as her own. "Yes," he said quietly, "I would be very pleased." The simple admission hung between them like a promise, fragile but real. Outside, the village continued its daily rhythms, but here in the weaving house, beside the bucket of precious dye and the loom that had become her anchor, Solveig felt the first stirrings of something that might, eventually, become home. The storm that descended upon Skarlund 3 days later came without warning, sweeping down from the northern peaks with the fury of winter made manifest. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, while winds howled through the village like the voices of angry gods. By midday, the world had disappeared behind walls of white, and travel between buildings became treacherous for all but the most desperate. Solveig had been working at the great loom when the first snow began to fall. The precious red dye Brandr had given her transforming ordinary wool into cloth that glowed like embers against the gathering darkness. The weaving house provided adequate shelter from ordinary weather, but as the storm intensified, she could feel the building shudder under each gust of wind. By evening, it became clear that this was no ordinary snowfall. The storm raged with the kind of primal violence that reminded even the most seasoned villagers of their fragility in the face of nature's power. Elder Thorvald made the decision to seal the village, barring doors and windows against the wind-driven snow that could bury a person within. It was Astrid who brought word that the storm shelter at the village's eastern edge had become necessary refuge for anyone caught away from the main settlement. The small stone hut, built generations ago as protection against just such emergencies, sat near the wood-cutting grounds where several villagers had been working when the blizzard struck. Brandr went to check on the workers, Astrid reported, her voice tight with concern. But the storm worsened so quickly, no one has seen him return. The words sent ice through Solveig's veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. The thought of Brandr caught in the killing wind, perhaps injured or lost in the white blindness beyond the village, made her stomach clench with fear she had no right to feel. Someone should go after him, she said, rising from the loom despite the obvious futility of the suggestion. In this weather, Astrid shook her head. It would be suicide. We can only wait and pray the shelter holds until the storm passes. But waiting felt impossible when every fibre of Solveig's being screamed that Brandr might be in danger. She found herself pacing the confines of the weaving house, her mother's worn cloak wrapped tightly around her shoulders as she listened to the wind's relentless assault on the village. The cloak had become more than mere clothing in recent days. It was her connection to the love and faith her family had invested in her journey, a tangible reminder that she was worthy of care and consideration. Now, as she faced the possibility of losing the first person in Skarlund who had shown her genuine kindness, the cloak felt like armor against despair. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The storm showed no signs of abating, and still there was no word from the eastern shelter. Other villagers had gathered in the weaving house, drawn by its central location and the comfort of shared anxiety. They spoke in hushed tones about past storms, about neighbors lost to the mountain's fury, about the fragility of human plans in the face of natural violence. Near midnight, when the wind had reached a pitch that made normal conversation impossible, a shape appeared at the frosted window. Solveig's heart leaped as she recognized the broad shoulders and purposeful movement that could only belong to Brandr. But as he drew closer, she could see that something was wrong. His gait was unsteady, and he seemed to be favoring his left side. She reached the door before anyone else could move, pulling it open against the wind's resistance to admit a figure more snow than man. Brandr stumbled inside, ice coating his beard and clothes, his face raw with cold but alive, wonderfully, impossibly alive. The workers, Elder Thorvald demanded as soon as the door was barred again. Safe, Brandr managed through chattering teeth. All accounted for in the shelter. But the wind brought down a tree, blocked the path back. Had to wait for a break in the storm. As he shed his ice-crusted outer garments, Solveig could see that his left arm hung awkwardly, and there was a darkness on his sleeve that might have been blood. Without thinking, she moved to his side, her hands reaching to assess the damage. "You're hurt," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Branch caught me," Brandr admitted, his usual stoicism cracking slightly as warmth began to return, feeling to his extremities. "Nothing that won't heal." But Solveig could see the tension around his eyes, the way he held himself that spoke of significant pain being carefully controlled. The legendary warrior, who had faced countless enemies, was struggling to hide the effects of one stubborn tree and a mountain storm. "Let me look at it," she said, her tone broking no argument. To her surprise, Brandr did not resist as she guided him to a seat near the fire. Perhaps the cold had weakened his usual walls, or perhaps the shared danger of the storm had created a temporary truce with vulnerability. Whatever the reason, he allowed her to examine the injured arm with gentle but thorough attention. The wound was more serious than he had admitted, a deep gash where a sharp branch had torn through leather and flesh, leaving a cut that would require careful tending to prevent infection. But more than the physical injury, Solveig found herself struck by the trust implied in his acceptance of her care. "This needs proper cleaning," she said softly, aware that half the village was watching their interaction with frank curiosity. As she worked to clean and bind the wound, using strips torn from her own underdress when nothing else proved suitable, Solveig became aware of the intimacy the situation had created. Here, in the flickering firelight with the storm raging outside, the careful distance they had maintained was no longer possible. "You were worried about me," Brandr said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. It was not a question, and the gentle certainty in his tone made Solveig's hands still in their work. She had been worried, desperately, irrationally worried, in a way that spoke to feelings she had barely begun to acknowledge. "Yes," she admitted, meeting his dark eyes. I have not had anyone worry about me in many years," he said, wonder creeping into his voice. The confession hit Solveig like a physical blow. The idea that this strong, capable man had lived without the basic comfort of being cared for seemed almost unbearably sad. Everyone deserved to have their safe return anticipated, their welfare matter to another person. "Well, you do now," she said firmly, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Brandr's expression softened in a way that transformed his entire face. The legendary warrior disappeared entirely, replaced by a man who was discovering what it meant to be genuinely valued by another person. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the warm circle of firelight, something precious and fragile had begun to grow between them. Something that might, with care and time, become strong enough to weather any tempest. The carved stone lay heavy in Brandr's weathered hands as he stood at the edge of the fjord, watching dawn paint the water in shades of gold and silver. 3 weeks had passed since the storm that changed everything between him and Solveig. 3 weeks of careful courtship and growing certainty that defied every expectation he had held about his solitary future. The marriage proposal stone was ancient, carved by his grandfather's hands for a courtship that had led to 50 years of devoted partnership. Its surface bore intricate knotwork patterns that spoke of eternity, of bonds that would endure beyond the grave. For years it had sat forgotten in his cottage, a relic of traditions he had believed no longer held meaning for him, but everything felt different now. The village had granted Solveig permanent residence 2 weeks prior, officially recognizing her value as a weaver and her contributions to the community's welfare. Elder Thorvald had made the announcement with gruff approval, noting that skilled hands were always welcome in Skarlund, regardless of their owner's origins or physical proportions. The decision had brought Solveig visible relief and joy, but Brandr had found himself wanting to offer her something more than mere acceptance, something that spoke to the deeper connection growing between them with each passing day. Their courtship had been unconventional by village standards, conducted through shared work and quiet conversations, rather than formal visits and chaperoned meetings. Brandr would appear at the weaving house with practical gifts, better wool, rare dyes, tools that would make her work easier, while Solveig would save him portions of her meals, mend tears in his clothing with careful stitches, and offer the kind of gentle attention he had forgotten could exist. They had discovered surprising compatibility in their shared experience of standing apart from ordinary village life. Both knew what it felt like to be simultaneously respected and isolated, valued for their contributions, but kept at careful distance because of qualities that made others uncomfortable. In quiet moments, they had begun to share the deeper truths of their lives. Solveig had spoken of her family's struggles, of the marriage arrangement that was meant to save them all, of the years spent believing her unusual height made her fundamentally unsuitable for love. Brandr had told her of Astrid's death, of the fury and grief that had driven him to seek death in every battle, of the gradual realization that survival without purpose was its own kind of dying. These conversations had woven bonds between them stronger than passion, deeper than mere attraction. They recognized in each other not just compatible souls, but complementary strengths, his fierce protectiveness balancing her nurturing steadiness, her gentle wisdom tempering his sometimes harsh judgment. But recognition was one thing, and public declaration quite another. The village had begun to notice their growing closeness with the same intense interest it applied to all matters of potential matrimony. Some watched with approval, noting how well-suited they seemed in temperament and stature. Others whispered concerns about the wisdom of two such unusual individuals binding their fates together. Gunnar Helgason, still nursing wounded pride from Solveig's original rejection of his rejection, had been particularly vocal in his skepticism. "Two misfits do not make a proper match," he had declared loudly enough for half the village to hear. Better to spread such strangeness among normal families than concentrate it in one household. But it was Elder Thorvald's private counsel that weighed most heavily on Brandr's mind. The old man had summoned him 3 days prior, ostensibly to discuss the village's winter defenses, but clearly intending a different kind of guidance. "The woman has found her place here," Thorvald had said without preamble. "But you must consider carefully what you offer her. Marriage to you would make her part of your legend, and legends are burdens as much as honors." The warning had been kindly meant, but sobering in its implications. Brandr's reputation cast long shadows, and any woman who bound herself to him would necessarily share in both the respect and the isolation his name commanded. "She deserves a choice." Brandr had replied quietly. "She does," Thorvald had agreed. "But choices made in ignorance of their full cost often lead to regret. Be certain she understands what life beside you would truly mean." Now, as Brandr turned the proposal stone over in his hands, he found himself wrestling with doubts that had nothing to do with his feelings for Solveig and everything to do with his desire to protect her from the complications his presence might bring to her life. She had worked so hard to earn acceptance in Skarlund, had finally found a place where her skills were valued and her contributions recognized. Marriage to him might jeopardize that hard-won belonging, marking her once again as different, setting her apart through association with his complex reputation. Yet the alternative, continuing their careful courtship indefinitely, never fully claiming the connection they both felt, seemed equally unsatisfactory. They were no longer young people with endless time to wait for perfect circumstances. If they were to build a life together, it should begin with honesty about their intentions and commitment to facing whatever challenges might come. The sound of footsteps on the rocky shore drew his attention. Solveig approached with the measured grace he had come to love, her tall frame moving with confidence that spoke to her growing comfort in this place she had learned to call home. She wore a new cloak woven from wool, dyed with the precious red he had given her, the rich color bringing warmth to her fair complexion. "You rise early," she said, settling beside him on the large boulder that served as his favorite thinking spot. "I had much to consider," he replied, the proposal stone still hidden in his cupped hands. They sat in comfortable silence for a time, watching the fjord come alive with morning light. A pair of fishing boats moved across the water with unhurried purpose, their crews preparing for the day's work. Smoke began to rise from village chimneys as families started their cooking fires. "Solveig," Brandr said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "There is something I would ask of you." She turned to face him fully, perhaps sensing the gravity in his tone. Her eyes, the color of spring water, held patience and trust that made his chest tight with emotion. "I have lived alone for many years by choice," he continued. "I believed my path was meant to be solitary, that I had nothing to offer that would not burden another person. But you have shown me that isolation is not wisdom, merely fear dressed in noble clothing." He opened his hands to reveal the carved stone, its ancient patterns catching the early light. Solveig's intake of breath told him she recognized its significance even before he spoke the formal words. "I offer you my name, my protection, my devotion, and whatever future we might build together. I ask knowing that marriage to me will not be simple, that my reputation will follow you as surely as your own shadow. But I also know that together we might be stronger than either of us could be alone." Solveig stared at the proposal stone for a long moment, her expression cycling through surprise, joy, and something that might have been fear. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady despite the emotion Brandr could see in her eyes. "Are you certain this is what you want? Not just comfort or companionship, but true partnership with all its complications?" "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied without hesitation. She reached out to touch the carved stone with reverent fingers, tracing the eternal knots his grandfather had created decades before. "Then yes, Brandr Eriksson, I accept your proposal with full knowledge of what it means and gratitude for the trust you place in me." The stone passed from his hands to hers, sealing a bond that felt as ancient and enduring as the mountains surrounding their village. The war horns echoed across the fjord like the voices of angry gods, their brazen call shattering the peace of what should have been a day of celebration. Solveig's betrothal feast had been scheduled for that evening, with the entire village invited to witness the formal announcement of her engagement to Brandr. Instead, the afternoon brought news that would change everything they thought they knew about her past and their future. The Ironback clan had come down from the northern peaks with 40 warriors and blood in their eyes, their longships cutting through the fjord's waters like knives through silk. Hakon Ironback, their chief, had waited until Skarlund's men were scattered across distant fishing grounds before launching his assault, timing his attack with the cunning that had made his clan feared throughout the northern settlements. Solveig stood with the other women and children in the village's central hall, her heart hammering as she watched through the narrow windows. The raiders had already taken the docks, cutting off any hope of escape by sea, while the landward approaches were blocked by warriors whose shields bore the distinctive iron-grey serpent that marked Hakon's personal guard. "They want tribute," Elder Thorvald announced grimly as he returned from the parley Hakon had demanded. "Gold, livestock, and his eyes found Solveig across the crowded room. "Specific people, they claim, were stolen from their lands." A cold certainty settled in Solveig's stomach as the elder's gaze remained fixed on her. Somehow impossibly, her past had followed her to this place where she had finally found belonging. "What does that mean?" Brandr demanded, his hand moving instinctively to the war axe at his side. "It means," said a new voice from the hall's entrance, "that the woman you would marry carries blood that belongs to my clan." Hakon Ironback strode into the hall with the confidence of a man who knew himself to be in complete control. He was tall, even by northern standards, his iron-grey hair braided with the bone ornaments that marked his numerous victories. Scars decorated his arms like trophies, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had never known defeat. Behind him walked an elderly woman whose appearance sent shock through Solveig like lightning through water. The woman's face was lined with age, but the bone structure was unmistakably familiar. The same high cheekbones, the same proud bearing, the same unusual height that had marked Solveig as different all her life. Grandmother Ragnhild. Solveig whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. The old woman's eyes filled with tears as she took in Solveig's appearance. My granddaughter, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You have grown so tall, so strong. You look exactly as Thyra did at your age. The name hit the assembled villagers like a thunderclap. Thyra Ironback, the legendary shield maiden whose exploits were sung in halls across the Northlands. Brandr the Tall, who had led 3 successful raids against the southern kingdoms, who had stood alone against 20 Saxon warriors and emerged victorious, who had died in glorious battle rather than accept defeat. This is impossible, Elder Thorvald said, but his voice carried uncertainty rather than conviction. Is it? Hakon's smile was sharp as a blade. Look at her height, her bearing, the way she moves. Tell me you cannot see Thyra's blood in her veins. Ragnhild stepped forward, reaching into the leather pouch at her side to withdraw a scroll whose vellum had yellowed with age. The bloodline records, she said reverently, kept by our clan for 15 generations. Thyra had a daughter before her final battle, a child sent away for safety when the wars grew too fierce. She unrolled the scroll with trembling hands, revealing line after line of careful script that traced family connections back through decades of careful record-keeping. Her finger found a specific entry near the bottom of the page, and she read aloud in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall. Thyra Ironback, born in the year of the Great Storm, died in the year of the burning ships. Mother to Astrid the Fair-Haired, who was sent to the house of Eric the Farmer for protection during the clan wars. Solveig felt the world tilt around her as the implications crashed over her like a wave. Astrid the Fair-Haired, her mother's name, though she had never been called fair-haired in Solveig's memory. Her mother, who had spoken little of her own childhood, who had claimed no knowledge of family beyond the farming community where she had been raised. My mother never spoke of noble blood, Solveig said weakly. Because she was instructed not to, Ragnhild replied gently. The clan wars were vicious, child. Children with Ironback blood were targets for our enemies. Safer for her to live as a farmer's daughter than a shield maiden's heir. Hakon stepped forward, his expression triumphant. But the wars are over now, and bloodlines matter once again. The granddaughter of Thyra Ironback belongs with her people, not among these soft fishermen who know nothing of her true nature. She belongs where she chooses to belong, Brandr said, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled violence. Does she? Hakon's laugh was harsh. Look around this hall, warrior. Do these people see her as she truly is, or do they see only the strange woman who was rejected by a farmer? She has been wasting her gifts on weaving and domestic drudgery, when she should be learning the skills of her bloodline. As if summoned by his words, chaos erupted outside the hall. Shouts and the clash of steel announced that the parley was over and violence had begun. Through the windows, Solveig could see Ironback warriors engaging the few men who had remained in the village, their superior numbers and training quickly overwhelming the defenders. Enough talk, Hakon declared. The woman comes with us, willingly or otherwise. Her bloodline demands it, but as he moved towards Solveig, something extraordinary happened. The generations of denied heritage, the suppressed instincts of warrior blood, the fierce protectiveness toward the village that had become her home, all of it, crystallized into action that flowed from muscle memories she had never known she possessed. Solveig snatched a woodsman's axe from the wall display and dropped into a fighting stance that was somehow as natural as breathing. The weapon felt perfectly balanced in her hands, its weight and reach exactly what her body expected. Without conscious thought, she spun the axe in a complex pattern that cleared space around her, while positioning the blade for maximum effectiveness. The hall fell silent as everyone stared at the transformation. This was not the gentle weaver they had known, but something altogether more dangerous, a warrior whose training had lain dormant until this moment of crisis. Impossible, Elder Thorvald breathed. Not impossible, Grandmother Ragnhild said with fierce pride. Inevitable. The blood remembers. even when the mind forgets. Outside, the sounds of battle grew louder as more ironback warriors poured into the village. But Solveig was no longer thinking about heritage or bloodlines or the implications of her suddenly revealed identity. She was thinking about the people of Skarlund, Astrid the baker, who had shown her kindness, Elder Thorvald, who had given her a chance, the children who would wear the cloak she had woven through the coming winter. "I know what I am now," she said, her voice carrying new authority, "but I also know where I belong. These people welcomed me when I had nothing. They gave me purpose when I was lost. I will not abandon them to save myself." Hakon's expression darkened with fury. "You would choose strangers over your own blood?" "I choose the family I have built over the bloodline I never knew existed," Solveig replied firmly. "And I will defend them with everything I have learned I am capable of." She looked to Brandr, seeing reflected in his eyes the same fierce determination that burned in her own heart. Whatever she had been born to be, whatever destiny her bloodline might have demanded, she had become something else through choice and love, and the bonds forged in shared struggle. "Then you will die with them," Hakon snarled, drawing his sword. "Perhaps," Solveig said, raising the axe, "but not easily and not without cost." Ancient bloodline scroll lay forgotten on the floor as the granddaughter of Thyra Ironback prepared to discover just how much of her legendary grandmother's skill had passed down through the generations. The battle for Skarlund's soul had begun, but it would not be won through sword and axe alone. As the afternoon wore on and the Ironback raiders pressed their assault, Solveig found herself thinking not as the village weaver who had arrived weeks ago, but as the granddaughter of Brandr the Tall, a woman who had won her greatest victories through strategy rather than brute force. In the weaving house that had become her sanctuary, she worked with fevered intensity on what would become the most important creation of her life, the victory banner taking. Shape beneath her hands was unlike anything she had ever attempted, a massive standard that combined every skill she had learned at the loom with the warrior, heritage now flowing through her veins like molten steel. The banner's base was woven from the finest wool in the village stores, its deep blue background reminiscent of the fjord at midnight. But it was the design that made it extraordinary, using the precious red dye Brandr had given her and threads of gold that Elder Thorvald had contributed from the village's emergency reserves. Solveig was creating a symbol that would rally not just Skarlund's defenders, but every ally within sight of the mountains. The central image was the great oak that marked the village center, its roots deep and spreading, its branches reaching toward a sky filled with stars. Around the oak she wove the symbols of all the clans and settlements that had reason to oppose Hakon's expansion, a visual reminder that Skarlund did not stand alone in its resistance to the Ironback raiders. "You work as if the fate of the world depends on your stitches," Astrid observed, pausing in her own preparations to watch Solveig's flying hands. "Perhaps it does," Solveig replied without looking up from her work. "Battles are won in the heart before they are decided by the sword. People need something to believe in, something that reminds them why they fight." Around them, the village had transformed itself into a fortress. Under Brandr's direction, every able-bodied person had been assigned tasks that turned Skarlund's familiar buildings into defensive positions. Tables and benches became barricades. Cooking pots were repurposed as helmets for those who lacked proper armor. And the great hall itself had been converted into a command center where strategy was planned and wounded could be tended. The children had been moved to the most secure buildings, their care entrusted to the oldest women, while their mothers took up whatever weapons could be found. Even Gunnar, for all his earlier hostility towards Solveig, had proven his worth by organizing the fishermen into an effective fighting unit armed with boat hooks and gutting knives. But the true genius of their defense lay in the plan Solveig had proposed, a strategy that turned her newly revealed heritage into the weapon that might save them all. "The Ironback clan has enemies," she had explained to the hastily assembled war council. "My grandmother spoke of the old feuds, the settlements that still remember Hakon's raids against their own people. If we can signal them that the fight has begun, they might join us. And how do you propose we send such signals? Elder Thorvald had asked. Our messengers would never make it past Hakon's scouts. Solveig had smiled then, the expression carrying echoes of Thyra's legendary cunning. We don't send messengers. We make ourselves impossible to ignore. The victory banner was only the first part of her plan. Even now, Brandr was leading selected warriors to the high watchtowers that crowned the peaks around Skarlund. When the banner was complete, it would be raised on the highest point visible from the neighboring settlements, a signal that would carry for miles across the fjord country. More importantly, the banner's design would tell a specific story to anyone who could read its symbols. The oak at its center was more than just Skarlund's marker. It was the ancient sign of alliance, the promise that those who fought beneath it stood together against common enemies. The surrounding clan symbols would remind every viewer of their own grievances against Hakon's expansion, their own reasons to take up arms. But even as Solveig worked to complete the banner, she found her thoughts turning repeatedly to the man who had made this moment possible. Brandr's acceptance of her revealed heritage had been immediate and complete, as if he had always known she carried warrior blood and was merely waiting for her to discover it herself. You are not surprised, she had said to him during a brief respite from the preparations. I am not, he had admitted. A woman does not earn her place through weaving alone, not in a village like this. There was always something more in you, something that demanded respect even from those who claimed to disapprove. And you accept what I am, what I might become. His answer had been to take her hands in his own, his calloused fingers gentle against her palms. I accept everything you are, and everything you might choose to be. Thyra's granddaughter or Eric's foster daughter, shield maiden or village weaver, you are the woman I love, and that will not change. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Solveig felt the weight of leadership settling onto her shoulders like a familiar cloak. The villagers looked to her, not just for strategy, but for inspiration, seeing in her the living symbol of their hope for survival. The revelation of her bloodline had transformed more than just her own understanding of herself. It had changed how the entire community viewed their chances against the Ironback raiders, where before they had seen themselves as simple fishing folk facing professional warriors. Now they saw themselves as defenders of the granddaughter of Thyra the Tall. The shift in perspective had made them dangerous in ways that Hakon was only beginning to understand. The banner is finished, Solveig announced as she tied off the final threads. The massive standard seemed to glow in the lamplight, its rich colors and intricate symbolism speaking to anyone who looked upon it of strength, unity, and unshakable determination. Elder Thorvald examined the work with eyes that had grown bright with something approaching wonder. It is magnificent, he said quietly, worthy of the woman who created it and the cause it will serve. But there was more to prepare before the banner could be raised. Solveig had spent hours with grandmother Ragnhild, learning the battle songs that would carry across the mountains, the ancient calls that would announce to every settlement within range that Thyra's blood had awakened and war had begun in earnest. The old woman had wept as she taught the songs, her voice cracking with emotion as she shared the musical heritage that had been denied to Solveig for so many years. Your mother would be so proud, she had whispered. She gave up everything to keep you safe, but she would rejoice to see you claim your birthright at last. As evening approached, the final elements of their defense fell into place. The banner was carefully transported to the highest tower, where Brandr waited with the warriors who would help raise it. Signal fires had been prepared on every peak, ready to carry word of their defiance to settlements that might choose to aid them. In the village below, every person capable of holding a weapon had taken their assigned position. They were outnumbered, certainly, and many lacked the training that would make them truly effective fighters. But they possessed something that Hakon's hired warriors could not match, the fierce determination. of people defending their home against those who would destroy it. Solveig took her place at the tower's highest point, the victory banner flowing in the mountain wind beside her. From this vantage point, she could see the ironback encampment spread across the shoreline like a dark stain against the water. Hakon's forces were impressive, but they had made the crucial error of believing that reputation and numbers would be enough to break Skarlund's resistance. They were about to discover their mistake. As the last light faded from the western sky, Solveig raised her voice in the ancient war song her grandmother had taught her. The melody carried across the mountains like a challenge thrown in the face of the gods themselves, its lyrics proclaiming that Thyra's blood had awakened and would not be denied. From the peaks around Skarlund, answering songs began to echo as the signal fires blazed to life. One by one, then in growing chorus, the settlements that had their own reasons to hate Hakon Ironback added their voices to the call. The granddaughter of Brandr the Tall was claiming her heritage at last, and the mountains themselves seemed to sing in approval. In the Ironback camp below, Hakon Ironback looked up at the banner flying from Skarlund's highest tower, and for the first time in years felt the cold touch of uncertainty. He had come expecting to claim a wayward clan member and extract tribute from frightened villagers. Instead, he faced the awakened fury of a shield maiden's heir who had chosen her ground and called her allies to the fight. The real battle was about to begin. The dawn attack came with the fury of winter storms and the precision of master craftsmen. Hakon Ironback had spent the night studying Skarlund's defenses, and his assault reflected the strategic mind that had made him feared across the Northlands. But what he had not counted on was fighting the granddaughter of Brandr the Tall on ground of her own choosing. With weapons forged from both steel and cymbal, Solveig stood atop the central watchtower, her matching shield raised beside Brandr's in a display of unity that sent ripples of power through both defending and attacking forces. The shields themselves had become artifacts of significance. Overnight, circular wooden boards that Solveig had carved with interlocking designs representing their partnership in both love and war, where her shield bore the oak tree of Skarlund, surrounded by the symbols of weaving, shuttle, and loom rendered in flowing lines, Brandr's carried. The same oak encircled by the crossed axes of his warrior heritage. But it was the way the designs flowed together when the shields were held side by side that made them truly powerful. The patterns merged and completed each other, creating a visual representation of two souls joined in common purpose. "They come," Brandr said quietly, his voice carrying the calm that marked experienced warriors in the moments before violence. From the shoreline, Hakon's forces advanced in disciplined ranks, their iron-grey shields forming an impenetrable wall, while their war cries echoed across the fjord. These were not raiders seeking easy plunder, but professional fighters who had broken stronger defenses than anything Skarlund could offer, or so they believed. The first surprise came when the villagers did not break and run at the sight of 40 armed warriors marching toward their homes. Instead, they stood firm at their positions, farmers and fishermen who had discovered that protecting what you love can transform anyone into a force to be reckoned with. The confidence that should have crumbled in the face of superior numbers held steady, anchored by trust in the woman who had become their unexpected leader. The second surprise came when Solveig raised her voice in the ancient war song, her clear tones carrying across the valley like a challenge thrown in the face of fate itself. This was not the tentative melody of someone learning her heritage, but the full-throated battle cry of a woman who had claimed her birthright and would defend it with everything she possessed. From the mountains around Skarlund, answering voices began to join the song. The signal fires of the previous night had done their work. Warriors from 3 allied settlements were descending from the high passes, their own grudges against Hakon giving them reason to answer Thyra's granddaughters. But it was the third surprise that shattered Hakon's certainty of victory as his warriors reached the outer defenses of the village. They found themselves facing not desperate villagers, but a coordinated defense that used every advantage the terrain could provide. Solveig's strategy had turned familiar buildings into deadly obstacles, creating choke points where superior numbers became disadvantages and forcing the attackers to fight on ground that favored the defenders. More importantly, she fought among them. The woman who had been rejected as too tall for marriage moved through the battle like a force of nature, her woodsman's axe cutting through enemy ranks with precision that spoke to generations of warrior blood. Each swing was economical, purposeful, designed to disable rather than simply wound. This was not berserker fury, but the calculated violence of someone who understood that battles were won through discipline rather than rage. Beside her, Brandr fought with the deadly efficiency that had made him legendary. But now his violence served a cause greater than mere survival. He was protecting not just his own life, but the future he and Solveig would build together, the home they were creating through choice rather than circumstance. Their shields worked in perfect harmony, each protecting the other's vulnerable moments while creating opportunities for counterattack. The intertwining designs carved into the wood seemed to pulse with life as the battle raged, a visual reminder that they fought as one force rather than two separate warriors. The tide of battle began to turn when young Magnus, one of the village children Solveig had sworn to protect, found himself cut off from the main defenses by a group of ironback warriors. The boy's terror was visible even from a distance, his small form trembling as enemies closed in with weapons raised. Something primal awakened in Solveig at the sight, not just the protective instincts she had always carried, but the fierce maternal rage that had made her grandmother legendary. Without hesitation, she broke from her position and charged toward the isolated child, her battle cry splitting the air like thunder. The ironback warriors turned to face this new threat, confident that a single woman could not stand against three armed men. They had not reckoned with fighting someone who carried the blood of Brandr the Tall and the fury of a mother protecting her young. What followed was a display of skill and ferocity that would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations. Solveig's axe became a blur of motion, each strike flowing into the next with deadly grace. She moved like the wind across water, impossible to pin down, always striking from unexpected angles. But numbers and skill could only carry her so far. As she reached Magnus and pulled him behind the safety of her shield, Solveig felt the burning line of a sword edge across her ribs. Pain flared bright and immediate, but determination burned brighter still. She would not fall here. She would not leave this child orphaned or this village defenseless. The shield pair that had symbolized her unity with Brandr became her salvation as he appeared beside her like an avenging spirit, his war axe clearing space around them while she gathered the boy into the protection of her embrace. Together, they began the fighting retreat that would determine whether love and determination could triumph over superior force and bitter heritage, the sacred healing. Herbs Solveig had gathered from the mountain slopes surrounding Skarlund now served purposes their ancient guardians could never have imagined. As the battle raged around the village's central square, she pressed the precious plants against wounds that threatened to claim the lives of people who had become more than neighbors. They had become family. Blood stained her hands as she worked with desperate efficiency, her injured ribs sending fire through her chest with each movement. But pain was secondary to purpose, and her purpose was clear. No one would die today if her knowledge could prevent it. The healing herbs, mountain arnica for bruising, yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for pain, had been part of her mother's teaching. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that preserving life was as important as any warrior skill. Now, as she moved between fallen defenders, Solveig discovered that her dual heritage gave her power in ways she had never imagined. "Hold still," she commanded Astrid the baker, whose arm bore a deep gash from an ironback sword. The older woman's face was pale with shock, but her eyes held fierce determination to return to the fight. As Solveig applied the healing poultice, she became aware that the battle around them was shifting. The arrival of warriors from the allied settlements had changed the mathematics of combat, turning Hakon's numerical advantage into a precarious balance. More importantly, the sight of settlements fighting together against a common enemy had transformed individual grievances into something approaching a unified resistance. "The tide turns," Brandr said, appearing at her side with his own collection of wounds. His left shoulder bore the mark of a spear thrust, and blood streaked his face from a cut above his eye. But his spirit burned as bright as ever. "Not yet," Solveig replied, binding Astrid's wound with strips torn from her own dress. "Hakon still fights, and while he lives, his warriors will not surrender." Through the chaos of battle, she could see the Ironback chief at the center of his remaining forces, his great sword cutting down anyone who dared approach. He fought with the desperation of a man who understood that defeat here would mean the end of his clan's expansion. Perhaps the end of his leadership entirely, but it was not Hakon's skill with a blade that worried Solveig most. It was the cold calculation in his eyes as he studied the battlefield. She recognized that look from her grandmother's stories of Thira's greatest enemies. This was a man planning something desperate, something that would change the nature of the conflict entirely. Her fears proved justified when Hakon's war horn sounded a pattern she had never heard before. 3 long blasts, followed by 2 short ones, repeated twice. Around the square, his warriors began to disengage from individual combats, pulling back toward a central position with the disciplined precision of men following a well-rehearsed plan. "What are they doing?" young Magnus asked from where he crouched beside her, his small hands helping to prepare healing poultices with the efficiency of someone twice his age. Solveig's blood turned to ice as understanding dawned. "They're going to fire the village," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If they cannot hold it, they mean to ensure no one else can either." Already, she could see Ironback warriors moving toward the buildings at the village's edge, torches appearing in their hands like malevolent stars. In the dry conditions that had persisted since the early snowfall, fire would spread with terrifying speed, consuming everything the people of Skarlund had built over generations. "We have to stop them," Brandr growled, his grip tightening on his war axe. "No," Solveig said firmly, her mind racing through possibilities with the strategic clarity that was her grandmother's greatest gift. "We have to give them what they want." Before anyone could protest, she rose to her full height, her voice carrying across the square with the authority of her bloodline. "Hakon Ironback, I am Solveig, granddaughter of Thira the Tall. I claim the right of single combat." The ancient challenge silenced the battlefield as surely as if the gods themselves had spoken. This was law older than kingdoms, older than the clan feuds that had brought them all to this moment. By the codes, their people had followed for countless generations. Hakon could not refuse without losing all honor in the eyes of his own warriors. The Ironback chief lowered his torch, his scarred face splitting into a grin that held no warmth. "You would face me blade to blade, little weaver." "I'm no longer a weaver," Solveig replied, accepting the war axe that Brandr pressed into her hands with reluctant pride. "I am Thira's granddaughter, and I claim my heritage through trial by combat." As she walked toward the center of the square, her wound sending bolts of pain through her side with each step, Solveig carried with her more than just steel and determination. The healing herbs had shown her the power of preserving life, but now she must prove she also possessed the will to take it when necessary. The village children she had sworn to protect watched from behind makeshift barricades. The people who had welcomed her when she had nothing stood ready to honor her sacrifice if the worst came to pass. And beside the sacred herbs that had bound her wounds, Brandr placed his own life in her hands through the simple act of faith that love required. The granddaughter of Thira the Tall stepped forward to meet her destiny, knowing that victory would mean more than survival. It would mean the right to choose her own path in a world that had always tried to choose for. The wedding crown that adorned Solveig's head, 3 moons, later bore little resemblance to the delicate circlets worn by traditional brides. woven from winter branches that had survived the season's harshest storms, and carved with both their names in the ancient script. It represented something far more precious than conventional beauty. It symbolized love that had been tested by fire and found unbreakable. The duel with Hakon, Ironback, had ended as the old song said such. Contest should, with honor satisfied and justice served. The Ironback chief had fought with all the skill that had made him feared across the Northlands, but he had faced more than just Thyra's granddaughter in that circle of stones. He had faced the accumulated love of an entire community, the protective fury of a woman defending her chosen family, and the righteous anger of someone who had finally claimed her true worth. When Hakon fell, his warriors had honored the ancient compact by laying down their arms and acknowledging Solveig's victory. More importantly, they had listened as she offered them choice rather than exile. Join the growing alliance of settlements that chose cooperation over conquest, or depart in peace with the understanding that raids would no longer be tolerated in these lands. Most had chosen to stay, attracted by the vision of a different kind of strength than they had known under Hakon's leadership. They brought skills and knowledge that enriched the village, while their integration served as proof that even old enemies could become new family when treated with dignity and offered genuine purpose. Now, as Solveig stood beside Brandr before the great oak that marked Skarlund's heart, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had arrived as a rejected mail-order bride had discovered powers she never knew she possessed, had earned belonging through courage rather than compliance, and had found love that celebrated rather than diminished her true nature. Elder Thorvald performed the ceremony with the gravity befitting such an unusual union, his words carrying across the gathered crowd like a benediction. Representatives from a dozen settlements had come to witness this marriage, understanding that it symbolized more than the joining of two remarkable individuals. It marked the beginning of a new age in the northern lands. By oak and stone, by wind and water, by the ancient laws that bind us all, Thorvald intoned, I declare Solveig Eriksdottir and Brandr Eriksson united in marriage, partners in all things, guardians of each other's hearts. The cheer that rose from the assembled crowd carried joy that transcended the personal happiness of bride and groom. These people had seen their village transformed from an isolated fishing settlement into the center of a growing alliance. They had witnessed the power of accepting rather than rejecting those who were different, of celebrating rather than hiding the qualities that made individuals unique. As evening fell and the formal ceremonies gave way to celebration, Solveig found herself standing once again at the water's edge, where so much of her story had unfolded. The fjord reflected the light of countless torches like scattered stars, and the sound of music and laughter drifted from the village square where the feast continued. Brandr joined her in the quiet space, his presence as comforting as it had been that first night when he offered her a wooden rose and changed the trajectory of her life. The rose itself now sat in a place of honor in their home, the cottage they had built together at the village's edge, its rooms designed with ceilings high enough for both their frames and windows that looked out over the water where their story had begun. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Gunnar had not rejected you? Brandr asked, his arm encircling her waist with gentle strength. Solveig considered the question seriously, as she did most things these days. I think I would have spent my life trying to make myself smaller, she said finally, trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for someone like me. I would have been grateful for scraps when I deserved feasts, and now I know that the right person doesn't ask you to diminish yourself to make them comfortable. The right person sees your differences as gifts rather than flaws. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A lone rider emerged from the evening mist, and as the figure drew closer, Solveig felt her heart lift with recognition. Her sister Astrid, named for Brandr's lost love in a gesture that had meant the world to him, dismounted with the ease of someone who had traveled far and fast. I brought news from home, Astrid said, embracing Solveig with fierce affection. Father's debts are paid, and our brothers have found good marriages. Mother sends her love and her pride in the woman you have become. The message carried more weight than mere family news. It represented the completion of a circle that had begun with desperate necessity and ended with triumph earned through courage and determination. Solveig's sacrifice had indeed saved her family, but not in the way anyone had originally planned. "There is more," Astrid continued, her eyes bright with excitement. "A new bride arrives tomorrow, another woman seeking marriage in these lands. The village council asked if you would meet with her, help her find her place here." Solveig felt tears prick her eyes as she understood the full implications of the request. Skarlund had become a place where unusual women could find belonging, where differences were celebrated rather than condemned. The transformation that had begun with her own rejection had created space for others who might not fit conventional expectations. "Of course," she said without hesitation. "No one should face that uncertainty alone." As they walked back toward the village and the celebration that continued in their honor, Solveig marveled at the distance she had traveled, not just in miles, but in understanding of her own worth. The wedding crown on her head caught the torchlight like captured flame, a symbol of love that had grown from the fertile ground of mutual respect and shared strength. Behind them, the fjord sang its ancient song to the stars, while ahead lay a future built on the revolutionary idea that everyone deserved to be loved for exactly who they were meant to be. In the space between rejection and acceptance, between fear and courage, two outcasts had found each other and created a home where difference was not just tolerated, but celebrated. The granddaughter of Brandr the Tall had claimed her heritage at last, not through bloodline alone, but through the choices that defined her heart.